minutes after 9 o'clock in the morning. You found the breakfast show on News Talk K-57. We'll attack the environmental question on Lausanne and asbestos in the landfill and those kinds of things. I got another email this morning from somebody who was desperate and very anxious about a meeting over at Gita tomorrow, and said there's nothing. It doesn't say anything in the agenda. They're going to ramrod the culvert down our throat. We got word yesterday from Chris Duenas that is not an agenda item tomorrow. And in fact, tomorrow they may be talking about another issue, the waste to energy, and looking to hear, I think, from Ken Leon Guerrero again in that conversation. But there's plenty of other topics that we get a chance to talk about this morning, as we have for the first couple of days this week another opportunity to meet some of the names and the faces at Guam Regional Medical City. And this morning, Kevin Kerrigan, great to have you in the studio again.
Nice to be here, Ray.
Has brought in Dr. Ronald J. Innerfield, MD, and FACE at the end of that. I've got some initials at the end of my name that I threw in there just to confuse people. What does yours stand for?
It stands for face. And, anybody with a face as ugly as mine. Got
the big glasses and a beard. But that acronym stands for something, I'm sure.
It stands for the Fellow of the American College of Endocrinology.
Okay. Yeah. How long have you been in the medical game?
More years than I care to admit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where'd you get started?
I got started at NYU Medical Center in New York City, and then spent a year in Baltimore at Hopkins Bayview Medical Center, and then went back to New York, to Bellevue, to finish my medical residency and do a fellowship in endocrinology. And from then on, out into the wide world of endocrine practice.
Is Guam the most adventurous place you've practiced?
That's a good question.
Because you look like you could tell a story about practicing in darkest Africa or in deepest, darkest China in the middle of a revolution or something like that. Cuba during the Bay of Pigs. You could tell a story like that, you know.
Yeah, I could try. Actually, I've come here because I really love this part of the world. I love the water, and diabetes has been my passion for years and years, and every time I come out here and have to go back, I say, oh, why? Wouldn't it be great to be able to have a job and take care of people around here? And fortunately,
you found the right spot. We got a lot of diabetes here.
Oh, it's overwhelming, Ray. It's really obviously with epidemic proportions. I was telling Kevin before that this area of the world has the highest levels of insulin resistance imaginable. We used to think that the Pima Indians in the Gila River Valley of Arizona had the highest levels of insulin resistance, but turns out that the island of Naurua to our south, the Nauruans, have much higher levels of insulin resistance. And here on Guam, we're probably about 2 or 3, and that contributes to the really high incidence of type 2 diabetes that we have here. But there's also, I'm finding a high prevalence of type 1 diabetes as well. So
let's for me and the listeners, because I'll give you this look on my face like I know exactly what you're talking about, and I don't. I know that there's a kind of touch and go diabetes that my wife had briefly when she was pregnant, and that one was going to go away, so we don't worry too much about that. But then there's others. My mother had a touch of diabetes before she passed away as well, and there's all kinds of other people that I'm with every day that have got one or the other of them, and I honestly don't know the distinction. So, if you would.
Sure. Type 1 diabetes is really a disorder of the insulin-producing cells of the pancreas, and these cells get completely destroyed by an autoimmune attack. I could go into the biochemistry of it, but it gets a little abstruse. But
so we almost wanted me to ask about, now, what's the pancreas good for again?
Yeah.
Besides getting cancer?
It's an organ that does 2 things. It's exocrine in the sense that it makes enzymes to help dissolve proteins and carbohydrates and fats. But it also responds to the amount of glucose that's been absorbed and puts into the bloodstream a requisite amount of insulin so that the blood sugar doesn't get too high. And as a consequence, if you don't have enough insulin, your blood sugars tend to go up fairly significantly. And that's pathognomonic of what we call type 1 diabetes, where the cells that make insulin get destroyed by this autoimmune attack. Actually, it's interesting that it's a genetic disorder, and there's a mouse model for that, and in that mouse model, only about 1 in 6 of the mice that have the same genetic predisposition will go on to develop full-blown diabetes. So there's a genetic predisposition, and then there's obviously some things that have to happen in the environment. With individuals, if you, for example, have type 1 diabetes and have an identical twin, the concordance rate is about 30%. So your twin would only have a 1 in 3 chance of developing type 1 diabetes.
I mean, the obvious culprits are going to be diet and exercise. I mean, as far as environmental factors, right?
No, not necessarily.
Really?
Not for type 1. It's actually a matter of really probably exposure to antigens. You can take these mice, and if you put them in a really pure, germ-free environment, the incidence of type 1 diabetes in these mice goes up. Interestingly enough, yeah, it's just mind-boggling, and it's probably the way that antigens are presented to the immune system that's at default. People with type 1 diabetes don't have the ability to present the pancreatic antigens that say we're self to the part of the immune system that says don't attack these guys. Yeah. And
we're the good guys.
We're the good guys. And it just seems that when there's some other mechanism, when the body's exposed, that there are ways to circumvent that.
Is it confounding that it is so counterintuitive?
Yeah, it's what makes this kind of disorder so fascinating for those of us that are involved in the study of it.
Now, once those environmental factors disappear, they're alleviated, something has changed, and your autoimmune system goes back to its normal self, then the type 1 diabetes goes away.
No. Unfortunately, it doesn't. The type 1 diabetes stays around, and there's a progressive, complete destruction of the beta cells. As a matter of fact, probably it's been around for about at least 5 years. That ongoing destruction of the pancreas has been going on for 5 years before it's actually discovered. So the body can make enough insulin to overcome the usual demands, but when there's a crisis, when there's a concurrent illness, and the body demands more insulin, that's when full-blown type 1 diabetes gets discovered, and usually gets discovered with increased urination, thirst, and hunger. So you urinate a lot, you're drinking tons of stuff, and you're very hungry, and you're losing weight. So it's an explosive onset, as opposed to type 2. Now that's where the environment is again much more important, but also the genetics are even more important than in type 1, because if you're a twin and you develop type 2 diabetes, your twin has about a 95% concordance rate, a 95% chance of developing type 2 diabetes within that year or approximate years.
Now that's a pretty close genetic match, but I mean around here on Guam, and I'm sure that you've noticed this in your travels to Guam over the years, we're all related.
Right.
We're all not too far away from each other in the genetic pool here on Guam.
Right. Yeah, and that's probably it's the same sort of Pacific Island insulin resistance that ultimately relates to the very high level of insulin resistance that we see in places like Nauru. And it may be related to just the notion that the good Lord did not make us for all the food that we have currently available.
No, and there is that mentality that says, there's the thrifty gene that we've outrun here with our easy access to processed and fatty and high density nutrition food that we take in, and it's just an arm's reach away. In this studio, as a matter of fact, if I could reach around, and there's a soda pop that we've got in the studio. If I was thirsty, I could pop this thing in, and all of a sudden I would have crazy sugars all over my system, and that would be sending all kinds of odd messages to each other. I didn't have to work for that. I didn't have to slave outside in the hot sun in order to get myself that cold drink. I didn't have to go hunt for the meat that I'm going to eat tonight, or fish. or be outside raising the salad that I'm going to put together. So there's all these things that will conspire, and unfortunately, I think that maybe racially, ethnically, we weren't designed for that.
No,
and it's too hot on Guam to do any real exercise. So
yeah, and there's another issue that one of the diabetic epidemiologists used a term, Coca-Colanization, for the huge epidemic that we have in diabetes.
Okay, I'm a denier. I like Coke. I mean, I really do. I like Coke. All of the things that the doctors say.
Sure.
I probably should have in moderation. I try to have in moderation. I think there's some interesting things that the manufacturers are beginning to put in food. And I had the conversation with the other doctors yesterday about high fructose corn syrup, and I'm not a fan of that. And I believe in my heart that my body doesn't metabolize it the way that it would metabolize and deal with plain old table sugar that came out of a cane in Hawaii.
Right. Yeah.
Is there anything to that?
Yeah. Well, people don't realize that that fructose contributes as well. Though if you utilize fructose, you tend not to utilize as much glucose, and your glucose levels can go up, particularly if you're predisposed to diabetes. But the other aspect of this Coca-Colanization that I think is critical is the Western lifestyle that's been imposed on this beautiful island and beautiful islands in the Pacific, there's a lot of stress associated with this Western lifestyle. I mean, when you go out and okay, I'm going to go out fishing and see what we catch. I'm going to go out hunting. There's a low level of stress, but it's not overwhelming. When you're worried about, am I going to have a job tomorrow? How well do I get along? My boss doesn't like me. Someone else is causing problems, is talking about me behind my back. All sorts of things that we've created in the Western civilization, as it were, I think created a tremendous problem. And we're now finding out that we have drugs that actually act centrally in the brain. They don't act at the pancreas, they don't act at fat cells. They act in the brain to actually increase dopamine activity, dopamine.
We're all for that.
You're right.
Yeah, it's a welcome to the Pacific. If we could find a way to make something feel good, we should. That's an interesting view, though, and I appreciate that coming from you, because it means that when I go to you and say, hey, Doc, I've got these problems, and you start looking at me and saying, son, you're early diabetic here, maybe these are some of the things that we need to do, is I'll get the lecture on diet and exercise, but I'll also be handed some things that will take care of the psychological stress that comes along with living in the 21st century.
Right. Yeah, and I think we need to address that a lot more than we are. It's something that we realize that contributes to this whole picture, but we don't realize how critical that role can be. And we emphasize trying to increase insulin, or trying to lower obesity, or trying to control the carbohydrates that are eaten. Just to give you some insight, there was a wonderful drug that was an anti-marijuana drug, a cannabinoid receptor inhibitor, that lowered diabetes. You could quit smoking and not eat, not really have that increase in appetite. It even reduced cravings for other drugs. But this drug was turned down by the Food and Drug Administration. I thought it was one of the greatest drugs that could come down the pike.
I was sold on a couple of points in there. Being a former smoker myself.
Right, but unfortunately, the drug caused increased suicides in people. People who had a tendency for depression would commit suicide because all of the craving things that made them happy, like eating.
We shut it off.
We shut it off, and they became very because that's what they looked forward to. And so that's really a whole part of the picture. There are those of us who, when we get depressed and when we get stressed, we want to eat more. And that's part of. But
just because a drug may enhance suicidal thoughts isn't necessarily a nail in the coffin. I mean, there's on television, every other ad for a drug says, "Oh, by the way, there's suicidal thoughts here." When you get all this, and that always gets my attention. What do you mean? So, but the risk of entertaining more suicidal thoughts is outweighed, I presume, by the effectiveness, the efficacy of the drug.
Yeah, I would agree with you, and I was at the FDA for part of my career, and I would have approved this drug. but the FDA, in its wisdom, for whatever reason, decided that warnings were not enough and that we should keep this drug away from patients.
Can I buy it in Canada?
I don't think so.
Can I buy it in the Philippines? That's the world has gotten smaller with pharmaceuticals.
I know. It may be I think it was initially improved in Europe, but I'm not sure they still make it. It's a Sanofi Aventis drug. It's called Rimonabant.
Interesting.
Yeah. Just
people writing it down right now. Going to do a Google on something like that, because, like I said, the idea that, as I was joking yesterday with the doctors, decide I'm going to quit smoking and pop a pill and wake up in a couple of days and that's it. All of the physical urges would be gone, and it sounded like that drug will also help take care of the emotional attachments as well.
Yes, yeah, and the only problem is that the feeling, your overall gestalt of how well you're doing seems to be, and it's an anti-marijuana. You can you know what marijuana does. You want to eat, you feel good, and that sort of thing. So this is something that does the complete opposite of what marijuana does, and it makes people depressed, and so. You coach them and you say, listen, you're going to miss something here. Let me give you something else. So as we talk about dopamine and, runner's high, some people claim to get that, and other activities that might give you that sense of euphoria, would those be shut off by this drug as well? Yes. It would. And we're now learning that, when we drink a Coke, that may increase some dopamine levels, but then there's resistance to those levels of dopamine. We become addicted to it, and it's those addictive tendencies that tend to be lowered by this drug, which are the good parts of it. Now
you've got me very, very interested in a whole nother level of the conversation, and I'd want to get where's my psychiatrist? I want to get Juan on this one, because it's a very, very interesting concept that you were talking about. We'll get back to the diabetes, because there's a couple of things that I wanted to key in on while I've got a diabetes doctor in the studio, and there's plenty of people with diabetes right now that don't know it. Have no idea whatsoever that the silent killer is lurking in their body, and I know that you have written about early detection, and you maybe perhaps while you're out here would like to do things to help us detect this earlier.
Yes. Actually, that's one of my priorities here, and I've talked to the folks in the local diabetes groups, and they're very interested, and the goal is really to try to identify everybody who not only has diabetes, but also has children who are also at risk for diabetes. And I'm going to be talking about this at a meeting on November 15th at the Hilton for the local diabetes group on obesity. So the notion that we have so many, there was just paper published in Diabetes and Metabolism suggesting that 30% of diabetics in Korea did not know they have diabetes. In the United States, there were studies that suggested as high as 50%, and I think the incidence here may even be higher.
And that's not from medical illiteracy. That's just that we don't not feeling bad. I don't have any symptoms.
Right. We don't feel bad. And we don't want to go to doctors because they're gonna try to do something terrible. So we try to stay away and ignore the symptoms. But in point of fact, if we could identify diabetics early on, we could prevent a lot of the complications, particularly the dialysis, the renal failure, the eye disease, the blindness, the neuropathy that results in ulcers and loss of limbs. If we can get folks, when their blood sugars are, say, 150, and institute appropriate measures, we can prevent what we're seeing today, which is by the time people come to me and I ask them how long they've had diabetes, and they're already on dialysis. They say, I've had it for about 5 years. No, it's not 5 years.
Let's walk this backwards.
Yeah, it's been a lot longer than 5 years, and so if we could do that, if we had a database where we could identify all the diabetics, and we know who they are and who their children are and the weights of their children, we can take appropriate steps to try to really reduce the complications that we see, and ultimately make their lives a lot safer and a lot happier.
I'm talking with Dr. Ronald J. Innerfield with Guam Regional Medical City, and he has been presented to me as a diabetes expert. Now, there's a lot of people listening to the broadcast, and he's got his headphones on. If you've got some questions and you'd like to pose them, it's not very often that I get an actual diabetes expert in the studio. You're welcome to call in. I mean, I've got a few questions of my own, but I'll be asking them from a completely different perspective. If you have been a patient or you're contemplating it, or maybe you are one of those people that says, wait a second, I heard the man say obesity. I'm not obese, but I've got diabetes. Why is that? What did I do wrong? And so let's, by way of striking up a conversation, what about people that don't look like they've got anything wrong with them?
Yeah, there's a couple of situations. One would be there is a kind of type 1 that's low level. Mm-hmm. It's called type 1 latent onset diabetes of adulthood. And so you could have that. And I think there is a whole group of folks here on this island that do have some type 1 diabetes.
Yeah.
And don't know it. Secondly, if you're a smoker or have been a smoker, you have about twice the likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes.
I quit about 5-6 years ago.
Good.
Well, it's good that I quit, but I mean, am I out of that target range yet?
That's clearly there's got to be some sort of genetic predisposition if you've got type 2 diabetes, and I don't know. Are you on drugs? Are you on oral agents for your diabetes? Are you diet controlled?
I take vitamins and fish oil.
Okay, good. I think fish oil is wonderful. I take 6 grams of it myself every day.
Isn't that great to hear? If you are one of the fish oil people out there, isn't that nice to hear? The doctor says fish oil is good. I take it myself.
Yeah, the reason I like it is there were the chairman of the medical department at Mass General, a guy named Alex Leaf, used to study fish oils, and he found that the heart, if you could take these muscle cells and you can cause them to go into what's called fibrillation, the electrical activity and people die when they have heart attacks and they go into this fibrillation. Whereas if you incubate these cells with fish oils and then try to induce this fibrillation, you can suppress that. So in point of fact, it may not prevent you from getting a heart attack, but if you do get a heart attack, it will keep you alive because you won't have this life-threatening, where your heart doesn't contract. It just fibrillates. There's really a lot of...
I'm digging this conversation. See, I thought the benefit was the occasional burp that tasted like a tuna sandwich, but that's just me, 9:31 in the morning. Calls are lining up. 477-5757 is the telephone number.